April 4th, 1944. A cold wind swept across the small camp on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, carrying with it the sharp scent of damp earth and the promise of something both terrifying and liberating. The war that had ravaged the world for nearly 5 years had reached a brutal stalemate, and America's resolve seemed unbreakable. Yet for those who had borne witness to its devastation, peace seemed as distant as the stars themselves. In the midst of this tension, Captain Emily Dawson stood at the edge of a newly established camp, her breath fogging the frigid air. The long steel fences stretched out before her like the lines of a prison, though it was nothing like the places of torment she had read about in the news. The women who filled this place weren't soldiers, nor were they prisoners of war in the conventional sense. They were women, survivors of the shattered remains of a broken nation, taken from their homes in the closing months of the war's most violent acts. They were the wounded, the broken, the forgotten, and the displaced, those who had been pressed into service by a regime they had never fully believed in. Emily had seen war. She had fought it, lived it, and now, as a young officer of the U.S. Army, she was tasked with something she never thought possible. She was ordered to manage a group of German female prisoners, most of them former nurses, civilians, and non-combatants, who had been captured as the Allies advanced toward Germany's borders. They were far from the battlefield now, behind American lines, where it was supposed to be safe, but the remnants of war lingered like an open wound, raw and tender. Her mission was simple: oversee the care, treatment, and eventual release of the women once the war was over. But Emily knew that the journey would not be as easy as it seemed on paper. She had faced combat, made split-second decisions in moments of chaos, and witnessed the horrors of war. But now in this strange, quiet camp, her leadership would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The women stood in lines outside the makeshift barracks, their faces weary, their eyes hollow with the exhaustion of long months spent in confinement and fear. They were not soldiers, nor were they the enemy in the traditional sense. But to many of the American soldiers stationed here, they were still the other side. How could they not be after all they had been through? There were stories of atrocities, of brutal battles, and of the vicious propaganda that had fed both sides. Emily knew the soldiers would struggle with this new reality, the reality of having women in their custody who were not enemy combatants, but civilians caught in a storm they had no power to stop. Captain Dawson had heard the muttered complaints, the uneasy glances exchanged between the soldiers. Some didn't understand why they were being asked to care for these women, let alone show them any kindness. But Emily had seen enough of the human cost of war to know that this wasn't about revenge. It was about humanity, about finding a way to heal in a world that seemed incapable of healing itself. As Emily walked along the rows of women, she noticed the subtle differences between them. Some were barely more than girls, their faces still youthful despite the wear of war. Others were older, their eyes haunted by experiences too vast to understand. She could see the fragility in them, the way their shoulders sagged, weighed down by something heavier than their physical burdens. It wasn't just fear or hunger, it was something more profound. These women had lived through the collapse of a world they had once known, and now they stood in limbo, caught between the violence of the past and the uncertain future. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel as she approached a small group of women standing by one of the barracks. They were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, but when they saw Emily, they fell silent. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the curiosity and the distrust all mixed into one. "How are you all settling in?" Emily asked, her voice firm but gentle, as she addressed the women in front of her. She had been taught that leadership wasn't about issuing commands. It was about connecting, understanding the people she led. The women looked at her, uncertain. One of them, a tall woman with dark hair and sharp features, stepped forward. "We're not sure," she said in broken English. "It feels strange here, like we're waiting for something, something that might never come." Emily nodded slowly, recognizing the depth of what she was hearing. She had expected this. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that the war was over, the scars were still fresh. How could they not be? It was a wound that went deep into the bones of their very souls. "I understand," Emily replied softly, "but I want you to know that we're here to help. We'll take care of you, and you will have a chance to rebuild, to heal, just like everyone else." The woman seemed to absorb her words, her expression unreadable. Then she simply nodded, and without another word, she turned and walked away, rejoining the others. Emily exhaled deeply, her breath visible in the cold air. It was going to be a long road. The prisoners were not enemies, but their past was heavy, their memories jagged. They carried stories that would never be told, wounds that would never heal. But Emily knew that she couldn't abandon them. They had been caught in the crossfire of a world gone mad, and now it was her responsibility to help guide them through the aftermath. As the evening shadows began to stretch longer across the camp, Emily returned to the main building where the officers were gathering. She was about to open the door when she heard a voice behind her. "Captain, do you think they will ever trust us?" Emily turned to see Sergeant Ryan, a young soldier who had been assigned to her unit. His face was a mixture of uncertainty and genuine concern, the kind that only a man who had seen the brutality of war could wear. "I don't know, Ryan," she answered, her voice low. "But I do know this. Trust isn't built overnight, and neither is healing. We'll take it one step at a time. Just like them, we have to learn to move forward." Ryan nodded but still seemed unsure, his eyes glancing back toward the prisoners. Emily could sense his hesitation. He was a good soldier, but like the others, he struggled to see beyond the uniforms, the distinctions, the labels. She knew it would take time for all of them to adjust, and she had no idea how long it would take for the lines between us and them to blur. As the night deepened, Emily stood outside the barracks, her gaze drawn to the women again. Their silhouettes against the fading light looked like shadows of another world, a world that had been torn apart by violence, but was now caught in the delicate balance of rebuilding. But something in the air felt off. It was as though the stillness was a prelude to something. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The quiet wasn't just the calm before the storm. It was a fragile peace, one that might break at any moment. The days that followed seemed to drag on in a rhythm that was at once both monotonous and filled with tension. The camp had settled into a quiet, uneasy routine. The women were given basic supplies, food, blankets, clothes, and were allowed to spend their days doing what they could to keep themselves occupied. Some of them tried to start small conversations with the American soldiers, but most kept to themselves, lost in their own worlds. Captain Emily Dawson spent her days trying to maintain order, overseeing the day-to-day operations of the camp, making sure that the women were kept in reasonable conditions, and ensuring that the soldiers under her command remained professional. But the mental weight of her responsibilities weighed heavily on her. She knew that this wasn't just about managing a camp, it was about navigating an emotional minefield, and she was standing on the edge of it. Emily had always prided herself on her ability to make tough decisions, but now each decision felt like a misstep. Each action taken was one that could tip the fragile balance between peace and unrest. One morning, as she walked along the edge of the camp, she noticed Lieutenant Frank Saunders, a young officer who had been assigned to help with the logistics. Frank was a no-nonsense kind of man, a product of his upbringing in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. He was an idealist at heart, but it wasn't always easy for him to see the human side of the war. Emily had always respected him for his work ethic, but there were times when she questioned how much he truly understood what was happening in the camp. "Captain," Frank called out as he saw her approach, his voice tinged with concern. "We need to talk." Emily stopped in her tracks. There was something in his tone that made her uneasy. "What's the matter, Lieutenant?" she asked, her brows furrowing. "We've got a problem," Frank said, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers. "The soldiers are getting restless. They're not happy about this assignment. Some of them are starting to question why we're here, why we're taking care of them, when they're the enemy. It's making things tense." Emily felt a pit grow in her stomach. She had anticipated this, the distrust, the unease. But hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. She'd seen it in their eyes, the way some of the soldiers looked at the women, as though they were still the enemy, as though they deserved no compassion. The question was inevitable, and it was one Emily had been struggling with herself. What was the right thing to do in this situation? Could she really maintain the moral high ground while also ensuring the safety and well-being of the women? "I know it's hard," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But we can't let that dictate our actions. They may have been the enemy, But they're not the enemy anymore. Our duty is to treat them with dignity, and we can't forget that. Frank looked at her, his jaw tightening. I'm all for doing the right thing, Captain. But some of the men, they're starting to talk. And I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this under control. Emily paused, taking a deep breath. She knew what he was implying. The soldiers were at their breaking point. The constant tension between the women and the men under her command was becoming more difficult to ignore. The delicate balance she had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to slip. She could feel it in the air, the quiet undercurrent of anger and fear that was building just beneath the surface. Keep an eye on the men, Frank, she said quietly. We can't let this escalate. Frank nodded, but Emily could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe it would be so simple. Neither did she. As Emily made her way back to the main barracks, she was lost in thought. The soldiers' unrest was one thing, but the real issue lay in the hearts and minds of the women in the camp. They had been taken from their homes, from their families, and from their lives. They had been stripped of everything they knew and were now prisoners in a foreign land, under the authority of the very people they had once been taught to fear. And though they had surrendered to the Allies, it didn't mean they had surrendered their pride. Many of them still believed in their cause, still carried the weight of their loyalties despite everything that had happened. Emily knew she had to be careful. She couldn't allow the tension between the soldiers and the prisoners to escalate. She had to maintain control, keep everything from falling apart. But how? How could she maintain peace when it felt like everything was coming undone? That night, as Emily sat at her desk in the small administrative building, she heard a soft knock at the door. She looked up, startled, and saw Sergeant Ryan standing in the doorway, looking unusually somber. Come in, Sergeant, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. What's on your mind? Ryan stepped inside, his boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. He was a quiet man, but there was an intensity about him that Emily had come to respect. He had been with her from the start, working alongside her to maintain order, to keep things running smoothly. But lately she had noticed that he seemed distant, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't place. I think we've got a problem, Captain, Ryan said, his voice low. One of the women, her name's Ingrid, she's been causing some trouble. There was an incident earlier today. She tried to escape. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What happened? Ryan's face was hard as he recounted the details. Ingrid, one of the women who had arrived only a few weeks ago, had been caught attempting to sneak past the perimeter guards. She was desperate, Ryan explained, and though her intentions seemed harmless enough, to find her family to escape the camp, the soldiers had reacted quickly, seizing her before she could get far. We have to deal with this, Ryan said firmly. If she's allowed to get away with this, the others will follow. It's a matter of control. Emily felt a chill run through her. The decision was heavy, one that would weigh on her conscience long after the consequences had played out. The camp was still fragile. If word spread that one of the women had tried to escape and faced no repercussions, the fragile illusion of order would crumble. Lock her in solitary for now, Emily said, her voice sharp. We'll have a hearing tomorrow, but make it clear to the rest of them. We're not letting anyone leave until we can figure out how to handle this situation. Ryan nodded, but Emily could see the unease in his eyes. This wasn't just about one woman's escape attempt. It was a symbol, a crack in the foundation that threatened to split the camp wide open. As she sat in the silence that followed his departure, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. There was a storm building, and no matter how much she tried to prepare for it, she wasn't sure she could control it once it arrived. The days following Ingrid's attempted escape passed in a haze of tension. Emily couldn't escape the feeling that the fragile calm that had settled over the camp was just the calm before the storm. The soldiers were growing more restless by the day, their patience wearing thin, their distrust of the prisoners bubbling to the surface. The women, too, were on edge, their whispered conversations growing louder, their resistance to the confines of the camp more apparent. Emily had done everything in her power to maintain order, but she knew that the situation was spiraling beyond her control. It was late afternoon when the breaking point finally came. Emily had just returned from the mess hall after addressing a minor dispute between the prisoners and the soldiers when she saw Lieutenant Frank Saunders waiting for her by the entrance to the barracks. His face was grim, his posture tense. "Captain," he said, stepping forward as she approached. "We need to talk. Now." Emily's heart sank. She could feel the air crackling with the weight of whatever news he was about to bring. She followed Frank into the barracks, where they could speak privately. "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the unease crawling up her spine. "It's Ingrid," Frank replied, his voice tight. "She's not the only one. We've had 3 other women try to escape today, and there's more. A couple of the soldiers say they heard talk about another escape attempt tonight." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. Something was happening, something she wasn't prepared for. She had feared this moment, the moment when the camp would no longer be able to contain the growing unrest. "Where are they now?" Emily asked, trying to focus, to push through the panic that was beginning to rise in her chest. "They're being held in solitary for now," Frank said. "But Captain, this is bigger than just a few escape attempts. The women are organizing. They're planning something. And I don't know what, but I'm telling you, if we don't do something now, it's going to get out of hand." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the gravity of the situation. The women weren't just trying to escape anymore. They were actively rebelling, organizing in secret. And with each day that passed, the soldiers under her command were growing more frustrated, more willing to resort to force. "I need to speak to Ingrid," Emily said finally, her voice sharp with resolve. "We need to know what's going on before it's too late." The small, dimly lit room where Ingrid was being held felt like a prison within a prison. As Emily stepped inside, she saw the woman sitting on the ground, her back against the cold stone wall. Ingrid didn't look up at first, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if trying to retreat into herself. "Ingrid," Emily said softly, her voice firm but compassionate. "You tried to escape, but I need to know, why? What are you and the others planning?" Ingrid raised her head slowly, her eyes defiant, but there was also a flicker of something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a long moment, no words came. I had to try," Ingrid said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't live like this anymore. We were taken from our homes, our families. We don't belong here. They're treating us like animals." Emily's heart ached at the pain in Ingrid's voice. She had heard similar sentiments from other women in the camp, but hearing it directly from Ingrid, the woman who had dared to act on those feelings, struck her to the core. These women weren't just angry, they were desperate. "I know you're hurting," Emily said softly, crouching down in front of Ingrid. "I know this isn't easy, but escape, running away, it's not the answer. If you run, you put all of us at risk. You risk everything we've tried to build here." Ingrid's eyes hardened. "What have we built, Captain? We're just prisoners. We're not even allowed to see the outside world anymore. You keep us locked in here while you make decisions for us. What have we built, really?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had never thought of it that way, never realized how much the women must have resented their captivity, their powerlessness. She had been focused on keeping the peace, maintaining order, but in doing so, she had forgotten to acknowledge their suffering, their desire for autonomy. "I'm not your enemy, Ingrid," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to help, but you have to help me. We can't do this alone. I'm not asking you to trust me, but I'm asking you to trust that we're all in this together. If we want to get out of here, we have to do it the right way." Ingrid's eyes softened for a moment, as though considering Emily's words. But then, just as quickly, the hardness returned. "They'll never let us go," Ingrid said, her voice steady but cold. "They'll keep us here locked away until the war's over. And even then, we won't be free. We'll always be prisoners." Emily left Ingrid's cell with a heavy heart. The conversation had only deepened her understanding of what was really happening in the camp, but it had also raised more questions. She knew that Ingrid's words weren't entirely wrong. The women were trapped, and the anger simmering beneath the surface was growing. But Emily couldn't ignore the fact that an escape now would lead to chaos. It could jeopardize everything they had worked for. Not just the women's future, but the future of the camp itself. She needed to make a choice, and it needed to be made quickly. As Emily stood in the camp's administrative office later that evening, her mind raced. She knew the soldiers were growing restless. Frank had warned her that some of them were beginning to question her leadership. Emily could already feel the cracks forming in the fragile peace that had held the camp together. But the harder part, the part that weighed on her the most, was the moral dilemma she now faced. Should she enforce a strict punishment? Make an example of Ingrid and the others to show the women that their actions would not be tolerated? Or should she try to find another way, perhaps negotiate with the women and give them a chance to speak their grievances without resorting to violence? The door to her office creaked open, and Frank stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Captain," he said urgently, "there's been a situation. A few of the women, they're rioting. They're trying to break out of the barracks. We need to do something now." Emily's heart stopped. The conflict she had feared had arrived. Without thinking, she stood up. She knew what had to be done, but as she reached for her jacket, the full weight of her decision hit her. She wasn't just dealing with prisoners anymore. She was dealing with a fight for freedom, not just for the women in the camp, but for herself and for the soldiers who had to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. As the doors slammed shut behind her, Emily felt a sense of finality wash over her. Whatever decision she made now, there was no turning back. The night was alive with tension. It was as if the very air in the camp was thick with the weight of impending decisions, of things not yet said but already inevitable. Emily Dawson stood at the camp's entrance, her hand gripping the cold iron handle of the door. The air outside was still, heavy with the promise of something dangerous, something she couldn't undo once set in motion. The faintest murmur of voices reached her ears from the barracks. She knew something was happening, something that could change everything. For the women, for the soldiers, and for her. Ingrid's escape attempt had been the spark, but tonight, something larger was unfolding. The rumors that had swirled like smoke in the camp had turned into a fire. The women were no longer just speaking of escape. They were acting on it. Their whispered conversations had become plans. Their fear had turned into defiance. As Emily made her way toward the barracks, she passed the soldiers standing watch. Their faces were grim, their eyes trained on the barracks, knowing that any moment could spark a full-blown riot. She had ordered the camp to be put on lockdown, but even she knew it was too late for order. The walls that had held the women in, the walls they had been forced behind, were beginning to crack. "Captain, it's happening," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper as he fell into step beside her. "They're gathering, planning something. There's no stopping them now." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She was standing at the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. She had to act. But what was the right choice? "I have to talk to them," Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I can't let it end like this." Frank's eyes flickered with doubt, his jaw tightening. "You're not thinking about negotiating with them, are you? They're ready to fight. If you go in there—" "I'm not negotiating," Emily interrupted, her gaze sharp. "But I have to at least try." The barracks were dimly lit, the air thick with the sense of unrest. As Emily stepped inside, she was met with a silence that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The women were gathered in the center of the room, their faces hard, their postures defiant. Ingrid stood at the front, her eyes burning with something between resolve and desperation. The rest of the women watched her, waiting for her lead. "You shouldn't be here," Ingrid said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "This is no longer about survival, Captain. This is about freedom." Emily felt her breath catch. She knew what Ingrid was saying. The women were not just looking to escape anymore. They were ready to fight for their dignity, their humanity. "I didn't come to fight," Emily said, her voice firm but laden with sorrow. "I came to stop this, to stop the pain, to stop the cycle of anger. You're fighting for freedom, but you're also fighting for something else, and it's not worth the cost." Ingrid stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "What do you know about freedom? You're not the one behind these walls. You're not the one who's had everything taken from her. You're the one who locks us in here." Emily felt a pang in her chest, but she steeled herself. "I don't lock you in, Ingrid. I'm trying to protect you. But if you fight, if you start this riot, you won't just lose your freedom. You'll lose your chance for anything better. Do you want that? Do you want to be nothing more than the enemy you once fought?" The room was heavy with the weight of her words. The women shifted uneasily, but Ingrid didn't flinch. She looked at Emily, her eyes searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of the kindness that had guided Emily's actions up until now. But there was nothing there, nothing that would break the resolve that had settled in Emily's bones. "I want a future," Ingrid said, her voice trembling. "But not like this, not under their control. I want to live." Emily reached out, her voice softening. "You will live, Ingrid, but not by tearing everything apart. Don't throw away what little you have left." Ingrid hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the other women in the room. They were waiting for her, waiting for a decision. The silence stretched long, tense, before Ingrid finally spoke. "We are already dead," she whispered. "Do you really think you can save us now?" At that moment, the sound of shouting reached Emily's ears, sharp and clear. The women in the barracks immediately turned their heads, panic flickering across their faces. Emily's heart clenched. The moment she had feared had arrived. The women outside were rioting, trying to break through the gates. They were desperate, angry, and fueled by the same fire Ingrid had just spoken of. "Frank!" Emily shouted, turning toward the door. "Get the men! We have to contain this now." But as she made her way to the door, she stopped. A thought froze her in place. One question that would shape everything from here on. What if she let them go? What if, for once, she stepped aside and let the women take the freedom they so desperately sought? The thought clung to her like a shadow, as if the walls between her and the women were no longer necessary, but the responsibility of her uniform, the weight of the decision, pressed against her chest. She had been entrusted with a mission to maintain order, to protect. But in doing so, had she stripped the women of their humanity? The decision was made for her in the next instant. As Emily rushed outside, the camp erupted into chaos. The soldiers were trying to regain control, shouting orders at the women who had now pushed past the barriers. Emily could hear the women's screams of defiance and desperation, the sound of metal against metal as the gates rattled under the force of their escape attempt. But amidst the madness, Emily saw something that broke her heart in two. Ingrid was standing at the front, her eyes locked onto Emily's. And in that brief, fleeting moment, Emily saw what she had failed to understand all along. Ingrid wasn't just trying to escape the camp. She was making a sacrifice. She was giving herself up to lead the others to freedom. As the soldiers began to close in, Ingrid's gaze never wavered. Her eyes, once filled with anger, now carried a different weight, one of quiet acceptance, a recognition of the price she was willing to pay. It was as if she knew what would happen next, as if she understood that this was her moment of final defiance. "Let them go, Captain," Frank said quietly behind her, his voice filled with resignation. "They won't stop, and neither will you." The words hit Emily like a tidal wave, and for the first time since the chaos began, she realized that she had a choice between control and freedom, between maintaining her duty and letting go. She turned to Frank, her mind racing, and then, without a word, made her decision. The women surged forward, pushing past the soldiers, and Emily allowed them to go. As Ingrid led the charge, she gave Emily one last fleeting look, one that said everything, one that said, "We were never prisoners, not really." As the gates opened, the women disappeared into the night, free at last. But Emily knew that freedom, like peace, was never truly without a price. The camp fell silent, the sound of the women's escape echoing in her mind, and in the space left behind, Emily was left with a haunting question. Had she made the right choice? The consequences would come. But for now, she could only watch as the darkness swallowed the last traces of the camp, and with it, the last traces of what she had once thought was her duty. The days that followed the escape were quieter than Emily could have ever imagined. The camp, now emptied of the women who had once filled it, felt like an abandoned memory. The soldiers, too, moved like shadows, their morale broken by the very action they had been ordered to prevent. The tension that had once crackled in the air now hung heavily, a burden none of them could shake off. Emily had expected repercussions. She had braced herself for the fallout, for the inevitable consequences that would come from allowing the women to escape. But what she hadn't prepared for was the silence that followed. It wasn't a silence of peace, but of something much deeper, much more uncomfortable. It was as if the camp, now empty of the prisoners, was waiting for something that no one could name. The morning after the escape, Emily sat in her small office, the weight of the decision still pressing on her chest. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept replaying the image of Ingrid, her eyes defiant and resigned as she led the other women into the night. It had been the only time Emily had seen a glimmer of freedom in them. It had been the only time she had truly understood what they had been fighting for. But as the days passed, Emily began to question her decision. Had she done the right thing? Letting the women escape had felt like an act of compassion, an act of understanding. But the consequences were becoming clear. The camp had been left in disarray. The soldiers who had once respected her were now looking at her with doubt, their trust in her leadership shattered. Frank, who had once stood by her side, was no longer speaking to her. The bond they had shared, built on shared duty and sacrifice, was now cracked, the fissure widening by the day. She had spoken to the higher-ups in the military, explaining her decision and the reasoning behind it, but the words felt hollow. They had no interest in her justification. They were only concerned with the breach in security, with the fact that the women had escaped on her watch. The orders were clear. Get the camp back under control and restore order, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Emily tried to re-establish some semblance of authority. She enforced stricter regulations, tightening the guards around the remaining prisoners, and holding daily drills to prepare for any potential uprising. But the cracks in her leadership remained, like a stain that wouldn't wash out. The soldiers were wary of her, their respect for her replaced by something darker: suspicion. One evening, as Emily sat alone in the mess hall, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Frank," she said softly, her voice betraying the exhaustion she felt. "Captain," he replied, his tone distant. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing his next words. "You should have stopped them, Emily. We all know what happens when you let them get away. You gave them an inch and they took a mile." Emily turned to face him, the weight of her own guilt pressing on her chest. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They were desperate. They were suffocating in that camp. I couldn't just watch them die slowly." Frank's expression softened, but there was still a hardness in his eyes. "I get it, I do. But you can't let emotions cloud your judgment. We're soldiers, Emily. We're supposed to follow orders." "I did follow orders," she said quietly, standing up from the table. "But sometimes, Frank, orders are wrong. Sometimes the right thing isn't what's written on a piece of paper. Sometimes it's about what's in here." She pointed to her chest. I thought if I let them go, it might give them a chance to live." Frank shook his head. "And now we're stuck in this mess. We don't know if they'll come back, if they'll be back with more of their kind, and worse, we don't know if we'll be prepared." The silence between them stretched long, and Emily could see the disappointment in his eyes, the betrayal he felt not just in her decision, but in the entire situation. The truth was, Emily hadn't been prepared for what had come after. She had hoped that the escape would be the end of the conflict, that the women would find freedom, and that she could return to her duties with a clear conscience. But freedom was never that simple. As the weeks passed, Emily's sense of isolation grew. The soldiers no longer looked at her with respect. Instead, they avoided her gaze, speaking in hushed tones when she passed by. The women who remained in the camp, the few who had not attempted to escape, were subdued. Emily could sense their unease, their confusion. They had watched as their comrades fled into the night, leaving them behind in a place they could not understand. The power dynamic had shifted, but it wasn't clear how or why. One afternoon, as Emily stood on the observation tower, watching the soldiers below, she saw a figure approaching from the woods in the distance. It was a solitary figure, walking slowly but purposefully toward the camp. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Ingrid. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, several other women followed, their faces tired but determined. They were back. Emily's first instinct was to run down to meet them, to somehow apologize for what had happened, to explain her decision. But she remained still, her gaze fixed on Ingrid as she walked through the camp's gates, her eyes never leaving Emily's. Ingrid stopped a few feet from the gate, her face hard and unyielding. "You let us go," she said softly, her voice carrying over the distance between them. You let us go because you believed we deserved it. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but Ingrid held up a hand, stopping her. You gave us that chance, Captain. You gave us the freedom we couldn't take on our own. But now we have to live with the consequences, just like you. We're not free. Not yet. Not really. Ingrid's words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment Emily didn't know how to respond. She had thought the escape would be the end of it. She had thought she had given the women their freedom, but the truth was, freedom wasn't something that could be given. It was something that had to be earned. By everyone, not just the ones who had been locked away. The women who had returned weren't seeking refuge. They weren't asking for protection. They had come back because they knew they couldn't escape the world they had left behind. They had come back because they, like Emily, had to face the consequences of their decisions. Thank you, Captain, Ingrid said quietly before turning away. But this war, this camp, none of it is over. As Ingrid and the other women disappeared into the shadows, Emily stood alone, her thoughts swirling. The camp was quieter now, and the weight of what had happened pressed down on her with a finality she couldn't escape. For the first time, she understood what it meant to fight for something. Not just for survival, but for freedom, for the right to choose. It was a lesson she had learned too late, but it was one that would stay with her forever. Inspired by a true letter from 1944, from a POW who wrote about the internal struggle of captivity and the price of freedom.